not able to watch the footage live, the webcast will be available for viewing on the County Council's website after the meeting. Please can I remind members to switch their microphone on when speaking and to turn it off when they have finished speaking, and also put your mobile phones either on silent or turn them off. It's a very select group we have today. There's a lot of apologies to be read out, but if we just go around and say who we are to start with. I'm Michael Rickman. I'm in the chair because Joe Orson unfortunately has such a bad back that he's had to go home.
Yeah, I'm Ewan Walters, and I'll just say we've had apologies from Councillor Orson, Hemant Ray Bhatia, Paul Wesley's standing in for him, Mr Culverwell, Mr Kevin Lloydall, Deborah Taylor, Mr Barclay's here for him, and Councillor Walters from Rutland.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Maroni Salalani. I'm one of the independent members. Councillor Elaine Pantling.
Councillor Manjit Hosseini.
Councillor Paul Wesley. Decent Crime Commissioner.
Paul Dawkins here for the confirmation hearing this afternoon.
Councillor Les Fillimore from Blackburn District Council.
County Councillor Ivan Old.
County Councillor Tom Barclay.
Councillor Andrew Woodman, North West Leicestershire.
Gordon McFarlane, Assistant Director for the County Council, advising the panel.
I'm Lauren Haslam, Director of Law and Governance, also panel advisor.
Thank you very much. The first item on the agenda is minutes of the meeting held on the 24th of September 2019. I will go through it page by page. If there's any questions, please indicate. Page 3 it is actually on your pack. Page 4 and 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. We don't need to propose, do we? Yeah. Could I have someone propose the minutes? Les, thank you very much. Second, Ivan Old, thank you. Item 2 on the agenda, public question time. We don't seem to have any public in at the moment. So that's item 3, to advise of any other items which the chairman has decided as urgent elsewhere in the agenda. Do you want me to do the secretariat now? No. Okay, yeah, okay. There are none. Item 4, declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda. There are none. So we move to item 5, the confirmation hearing for the Chief Finance Officer. I'm now going to invite the PCC to explain why he chose the candidate for the post and the process applied. Over to you, Lord Bach.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And thank you to the committee, the panel, for meeting today in order to hear this this application. I'm proud to present Ms. Paul Dawkins as candidate to be a temporary Chief Finance Officer for the OPCC. He's done this job before for the OPCC, did it for a period of some months a couple of years ago. It wasn't felt necessary at the time for there to be a hearing, as I understand it, for that appointment. This time, quite properly, you've decided to have a hearing. One reason might be because if this is a successful application, then he would be in post for longer than he was last time. The reason why I, on the resignation of the last Chief Finance Officer, who went back to be Chief Finance Officer for a local authority, whence he'd come from, is that this was at a time when it was still 9 or 10 months before I was to stand down. The panel knows I'm standing down next May. I took the view that in a position as important as Chief Finance Officer, it really wasn't very fair of me to appoint somebody now, nearly almost just 6 months before I stand down, to a post on a full-time basis. It might not be the person that the new PCC, whoever that may be, decides on, and that it would be sensible to appoint a temporary CFO. One of the reasons for that was that it had worked well last time. And I point out that last time when Paul was the acting Chief Finance Officer, it was about this time of the year too, so we were about to go through the budget process. It wasn't like some quiet time of the year. And in fact, the whole process worked really well with the police, of whom of course he is the Finance Officer, and the OPCC. We are of course aware that there's the possibility of conflict of interest. But you will see at Appendix B that there was a protocol that applied last time, when I say the matter didn't come before the panel, which we never had to call on at all, and which worked extremely well. I should point out to the panel too that there are other OPCCs and police forces who have the same Chief Finance Officer on a permanent basis. So this isn't some special thing that we're doing here or proposing to do in Leicestershire. It happens full-time elsewhere. Obviously, if there was any conflict of interest, I am certain that that would be pointed out by Mr. Dawkins himself. The Chief and I would both be very conscious of it indeed, and steps would be taken at once to make sure that decisions were taken properly. I have no fear that that will happen at all, and I'm absolutely confident that Mr. Dawkins will, as he did last time, do a professional, experienced job as Chief Financial Officer for the OPCC. If I have any doubts about it at all, we would not be sitting here now with this, and we would be in the process of selecting somebody else with a long vetting process, and the position would be much more difficult for the OPCC. The paper that's before you, which my Chief Executive, Paul Heinsohn, has written. I don't need to go through it. I don't think. It explains pretty well why we're seeking the panel's approval of this course. You can read there from paragraph 7 on, page 12, I believe, about the temporary appointment of a Chief Finance Officer. And then from paragraph 10, suitability for the role. Mr. Dawkins is more than suitable for this role, in my view. The working protocol is mentioned in paragraph 15 with reference to Appendix B, which I draw the panel members' attention to. And then there's a conclusion at paragraph 17. So without wanting to take up more of the panel's time, because I know you will want to be asking Mr. Dawkins some questions, and that's the important part of this afternoon's panel meeting. I just repeat, I'm confident that Mr. Dawkins will once again make an excellent temporary CFO for the OPCC. If I thought for a moment he wouldn't, as I say, we would not be here. He's done it before and done it with great skill. And so my request to the panel is that, having interviewed Mr. Dawkins and asked him questions, they agree to his temporary appointment. Obviously, any other questions that the panel would like to ask me before I go and sit outside, I'm happy to try and answer.
Are there any questions for Lord Bach? You're excused, Lord Bach. It's like being back at school. You don't have to put your hand up there. Right, so just going through the process and the powers of the panel. When notified of a proposed appointment under Schedule 1 of the Police Reform and Social Responsibility Act 2011, it's the duty of the Police and Crime Panel to hold a public confirmation hearing and to review, make reports and recommendations in respect of the candidate. Questioning during the hearing must relate to the professional competence or personal independence of the candidate. When questioning is complete, the panel will have three principal options as follows. In 1, if the panel is content with the proposed senior appointment, it can agree to report its endorsement to the PCC. Or, where a candidate meets the standards but the panel has concerns about their suitability, such concerns can form part of the panel's report and recommendations to the PCC. Or 3, in the event that the panel determines that the candidate does not meet the requirements for the post, the panel may provide advice and recommendations accordingly to the PCC in its report. The chairman of the panel will write to the PCC following the confirmation hearing to outline the decision and recommendations of the panel. The candidate will also be sent a copy of the letter. Should the recommendation be that the proposed candidate be endorsed, then the applicant can take up the post. Following a refusal recommendation by the panel, the PCC has the following options. The PCC continues with the appointment. Under these circumstances, the PCC should publicise a response focusing on why he felt that candidate did in fact meet the minimum standards for the post. The candidate can decide to withdraw, or the PCC can decide not to appoint and instead set out a timetable for the new appointment. As Lord Bach intimated, it's a very short period of time until there is a new PCC elected. There is a possibility that Mr. Dawkins may be actually required to serve longer than May so that the new PCC can get in post. So that is why we're having the confirmation hearing. There is on your table you'll have a job description. This is not what's the word? CV, that's the word I wanted. CV of Mr. Dawkins. He says he doesn't have one, but that is his job description, which has got a lot of information on it. Okay, so we now go on to, I would now like to invite the candidate, Mr. Paul Dawkins, to introduce himself and explain why he chose to undertake this role.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. I was invited by Lord Bark, as he explained during his presentation of the paper, to cover the role on a temporary position for the next 8 months or so. And as the Chair indicated, with the election of a new PCC next May, that may be extended beyond that point in time, and it will be a matter for that person to determine how they want to fill this role moving forward. But certainly, absolutely delighted to assist Lord Bark and the OPCC if I can over the next few months, and would very much welcome your endorsement of my appointment this afternoon, please, should you consider that I meet the appropriate standard. I'm happy, Chair, just to paint a little pen picture for a moment, if you would like me to, around what my relevant experience has been for the last 2 or 3 years to set
Absolutely, it's your time.
Okay, thank you. So I've actually joined Leicestershire Police in 1996 as the corporate accountant, and in 2000 was appointed as the then finance director. So been working at director level in the chief officer team for the last 19 years. And in the last 4 years, been quite an interesting time, and the relevance of that period I'll now explain to you, in the sense that 4 years ago, under the then Police and Crime Commissioner Sir Clive Loader, Leicestershire, Northamptonshire and Nottinghamshire were embarking on a strategic alliance merger of those three forces, and at that particular point in time I was asked to cover the Assistant Chief Officer Finance and Resources role, which is detailed in the paper, for all three forces. So my portfolio across the three force areas consisted of finance, estates, vehicle fleet, IT in Leicestershire only, procurement and support services across the other three force areas as well. So just over £500 million worth of revenue spend, around about £90 million worth of capital programme spend per annum for the three forces. And again, during that 4-year period, I was also asked to cover the OPCC, as was now OPFCC, CFO role in Northamptonshire for the current Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner Stephen Mould, which I did so for a period of 8 months. And Helen King, who some of you know, who was the Chief Finance Officer for Leicestershire, moved to Northamptonshire, creating a vacancy here. So as Lord Bark mentioned earlier, I then switched from covering the OPCC in Northamptonshire to, again, fulfilling a temporary role for Leicestershire. So all in all, 12 months worth of experience as OPCC CFO across 2 different force areas, and Assistant Chief Officer Finance and Resources across 3 force areas as well. So there was a period when I was covering 4 full-time roles, which is interesting in terms of prioritisation, managing the workload and potential conflict of interest. And it was during that time that the protocol that you see at Appendix B today was drafted to provide reassurance, not just the PCC and Chief Constable around potential conflict of interest, but also to police and crime panels in the force area. So since then, Strategic Alliance morphed into Triforce collaboration, and in the last 6 to 12 months, that again effectively has all but dissolved in terms of the concept of bringing together 3 force areas and closer collaboration across those 3 forces above and beyond what we currently enjoy as a region in terms of regional collaboration. So from the 1st of September this year, I moved back to Leicestershire on a full-time basis as ACO Finance and Resources. A week later then, Martin Henry, the former CFO for the OPCC in Leicestershire, moved back to Northamptonshire, as Lord Bark explained. And since the 6th, 7th of September, I've been undertaking the duties of the OPCC CFO alongside the OCA, the ACO Finance and Resources role in Leicestershire. So an interesting 4 years and a variety of roles that I've been invited to cover, and certainly learnt a lot during that time across the 3 force areas and working for 2 very different but also innovative OPCCs. So that just hopefully, Chair, sets the scene in terms of what I've been up to the last sort of 19 years or so as Director of Finance, and latterly in the last 4 years working across multi-force areas and OPCCs. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So now it's the turn of the panel members to actually question the candidate, and I think the first question is coming from Elaine.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that. My question is, what is the key to a successful budget, and what is the most challenging part of a budget for you?
Okay. I think for me, engagement with key stakeholders, not just on the force side, but also in relation to the OPCC, is key for setting out clear objectives and the strategy around how the budget process should be undertaken. So early dialogue around what the intended outcomes are, how we plan to work together as an OPCC and force to go about to the budget build for the following year is key. Stakeholder engagement, not just internally across the force and the OPCC, but also externally with partners, is absolutely key. So understanding what the needs are, what the demands are in relation to the budget for the following year, internally and externally with partners, forms a key part of that process. Once we've got that clarity, inevitably then there is a conversation around precept, and there's public consultation that we need to go through. So again, the OPCC and force working closely together and with partners around that is also key. So what the PCC ultimately determines in terms of the budget that he awards to the force in the following year and the precept that's associated with that is well understood and has been appropriately socialised and views sought around that. Beyond that, in terms of the technical, clearly having robust procedures in place that are open, transparent, and in the case of Leicestershire, written down in terms of the method that's applied and how we go through the actual technical elements of the budget build is also key. So we work very closely to another protocol in relation to that, which is subject to internal and external audit. So auditors will independently assess the robustness or otherwise of that, again to provide assurance and reassurance to the Chief Constable and also the PCC. So we go through a very rigorous process internally. Clearly, the role of the CFO and as a Section 151 officer for both the force and the OPCC is key to that process, as indeed is the Chief Executive's role as the monitoring officer. So a lot of work goes on in relation to that. The budget round has started this week in Leicestershire, and the process, as I've described, will now be taken forward. So at the end of that process then, what's absolutely fundamental to it is to produce papers of the right quality and detail for the Police and Crime Panel, and we intend to do that again for your meeting 29th of January, I believe, next year, where you'll be able to see the budget proposals that the PCC puts forward and scrutinise the detail therein and the objectives and the relevance of that in relation to the Police and Crime Plan and of the strategies and documents that the force, together with partners, works towards. So a rigorous process, detailed process, transparent process, which ultimately will come here to be scrutinised in the public domain. So that's my view as to what a successful process looks like, and certainly in the 19 years that I've been Finance Director stroke ACO in Leicestershire, that's the process that we've worked to and has worked well for us. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So it looks as though you've got a lot of challenges ahead of you. Of all those challenges ahead over the next few months for the OPCC, which would you identify as the single most important, and as a supplementary, why?
The single most important at this stage, actually, is the outcome of the potential general election and what that might mean in relation to the settlement for policing nationally, regionally and locally. Because normally what we would see is the settlement announced on or around second, third week of December. We would then plan in relation to that, which amongst other things would result in the PCC determining the level of precept that he wishes to precept for in the following year, which he will bring to the panel as a recommendation. We're probably not in that space this time round because, as we'll all be aware, the election could see some slippage to that timetable. What does that mean then in relation to the settlement announcement, the funding that's going to be available to the force next year, depending on who's in power at that point and what their view of that should look like. Beyond that then, precept rules and what that means for us in terms of flexibility around precept increase next year is also a challenge. So on the one hand, we're being asked to plan for the short term, the next 12 months, always with an eye to the medium term, but we don't quite know what the funding levels are going to be and what the rules are. And if there's slippage in relation to that, and that takes us into January, that's going to be a real challenge in terms of preparing the papers that you expect to see as a police and crime panel and bringing those to you in good time. So that's the number one risk. I guess there is a subset around PCC elections next year, new police and crime commissioner, who may have a very different plan and a very different view as to how things should be taken forward. So in setting the budget for next year, mindful of the limitations potentially in relation to settlement and precept, we do need to think about firstly the legacy for Lord Bark in terms of his outgoing budget for next year, and also where we can build in enough flexibility for the new PCC to use that to good effect in the next financial performance year. So, sorry, there's sort of two key things there rather than the one that you asked for, Chair, but I think they are linked and crucial really to my role potentially as the OPCC CFO over the next few months, but also to Lord Bark and to you yourselves as a police and crime panel.
that brings me on to another point, really, and we do know that Willie is actually standing down in May. So what actions are you going to take to ensure a smooth takeover and handover to Lord Berk's successor?
Well, as an OPCC and a force, we've already started some work in relation to that. So there is a transition plan. We've been here before, of course, when Sir Clive Loader was replaced by Lord Berk at the last PCC election. So we have a strategy, a plan that effectively will be developed and will evolve over the coming weeks and months to ensure that first of all, the candidates that wish to be considered for election to PCC are aware of what the key strategic and operational issues are, as well as the political issues in relation to the OPCC and its work with partners. So work ongoing there. Specifically in relation to my role, it is about providing an appropriate briefing to PCC candidates, and then to work very closely with the elected PCC come May to set out very clearly what flexibility that person has in relation to revenue, to capital spend, borrowing, all of those things, and how the PCC working together with their team in the OPCC and force can ensure an affordable, sustainable medium-term financial plan during their term of office, which again is a challenge because we may not be in a place at that point still where we know what our medium-term funding position is going to be. So alongside that, sharing with the new PCC ideas we have around efficiency savings, productivity gains, modernisation and the like will be key to potentially delivering savings and building in some flexibility within the constraints of the funding envelope the new PCC may have to live with when they're elected next year. So it will be an interesting transition. The force is practised in that. I'm personally practised in that as well, having worked with two PCCs here, two PCCs down in Northamptonshire during that 4-year period. So we have a means to identify what the key risks are and what the new PCC needs to consider in relation to fiscal issues and how they impact on operational issues. And we will share that in due course with them in a structured way and invite some scrutiny and feedback in relation to that around what their ideas might be, which could differ from ours. Okay.
Thank you, that's very clear. The next question I have is from Councillor Phillimore.
Thank you, Chair. Paul, you've actually commented on a number of times of some of the issues and the fact that politics, general election, run up to an election for the PCC, you have therefore a foot in two camps. One is completely apolitical within the police authority itself, and within the OPCC, the Police and Crime Commissioner is a political appointment. And there could be an opportunity for the current budget setting and the current strategies to become a bit of a political animal that could either assist or not assist the incoming PCC next year. You, in this joint role, would have complete oversight and insight of performance, staffing numbers, you name it, you will have sight of it. How would you maintain your impartiality to any political influence, having a foot in two camps, one being completely apolitical and the other one being a political environment by default?
Okay, thank you. I mean, I certainly would take members to Appendix B and the protocol, which I'll talk about in a moment. But in terms of initial response to that, certainly for me, what I've worked hard to achieve in the past with treasurers and latterly chief finance officers that have worked in the OPCC is to ensure that we only have one version of the truth. So we don't have contradictory advice provided by the CFO for the chief compared to the advice provided by the CFO to the PCC. So in the past, those two roles have worked extremely closely together, and I've been an advocate of that and ensured that that's been the case. So trust is at the heart of that particular relationship. When it's only one person, I absolutely accept that potentially there could be a challenge around that, and a person's integrity could be compromised, perhaps. My role potentially as the OPCC Chief Finance Officer is to be a financial advisor, not a political advisor. And the same applies in terms of my role to the Chief Constable. So for me, it's about having absolute clarity, transparency around how I've arrived at the financial advice that I may be asked to provide, to ensure that there is one version of that truth that's reported to both the Chief Constable and the PCC, to ensure that that is understood, and hopefully there's agreement around what that means, the potential impact of that, both in a political and an operational sense. But that's a matter for the PCC and the Chief respectively to judge what that might be, based on the financial advice that I provide to them. Would I see that potentially as putting me in a place where there could be a conflict of interest? Perhaps, yes, if the Chief Constable and the PCC did not agree. But the advice that I would provide would be unchanged. And in terms of some safeguards that we have in relation to that, they are set out under risk and mitigation from paragraph 9 onwards in Appendix B. And you will see that, as well as the Chief Executive is the monitoring officer internally, there are a number of external auditors and frameworks and legal responsibilities that I am certainly aware of, others are aware of, and would hold me to account for the correct application of those things, to ensure that there is no conflict of interest and the advice that I give isn't compromised in any way. So I think those safeguards are fairly clearly set out in that appendix, and hopefully provides reassurance that on a day-to-day basis there wouldn't be any particular issues that are likely to challenge that arrangement of a shared CFO. Thank you.
Would you like to come back, Liz?
If I may, so because the supplementary element of that then is if you give Simon £100 million, £200 million, whatever it is, Simon will find a way of using that money to good effect. Part and parcel of the budgeting process, and whether we like it or not, we're in a complex situation. A, because of where we are as far as GE, B, because of where we are as replacement of the Police and Crime Commissioner, C, the budgeting cycle, the settlement cycle, which leads to the precept. And how it's perhaps not a fair or easy question to answer. How would you, with a foot in both camps, divest yourself of any element where the precept request could be used as a political football?
I think the first thing to recognise is that the decision in relation to precept increase sits solely with the PCC. The Chief, as the PCC's operational advisor, would effectively advise the PCC what he would ideally want the budget to be for the following year, and would spell out very clearly what level of service that would provide. The PCC then has to take that into account, and would, and in my experience very carefully has, during Lord Back's term, and will take a view in relation to then the level of precept increase that he feels able to support, given what the Chief is asking him to provide in relation to budget. And if there is a shortfall, if there is a difference of view and opinion, and that's the decision of Lord Berk, then what the Chief would do and what I would do with a foot in both camps would be to rework what that means, not just in terms of the financial implications, but also what impact that might have on service outcomes, not just force provided service outcomes, but services that we provide in partnership locally and regionally as well. And we look at that, we would risk assess that, we will consider the impact of that, and then Lord Berk will be invited to consider the consequences of that. But fundamentally, having gone through that process, the PCC's decision around precept will be respected, will be accepted, and the Chief would then work within the funding envelope that's provided. But I would like to imagine in that situation there will be two-way dialogue, there will be appropriate consultation, not just necessarily between the PCC and the Chief, but again with partners locally across Leicester, Leicestershire, Rutland and the East Mids region, where we partner with other forces, and we've arrived at a position where everybody felt comfortable with the approach that was being taken and the level of precept and the implications of that that we were being asked to consider and work with. So I don't think there will be a situation where me working in a potential shared role would come into conflict with either the PCC or the Chief in relation to that. I would simply be providing them with the information upon which they could form a view and ultimately make a decision.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I think your description of the time we're in at the moment, Les, as complex is actually spot on. We don't know yet what's going to happen. I have a question next from Councillor Manjit Kaur.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, Paul. What role would you play in the development and maintenance of the police and crime plan? How would you influence the PCC with regards to the priorities in the plan?
Okay, I mean, certainly in relation to the political aspects of the plan, that's absolutely a matter for the PCC and not for my role. My input to the plan would be probably in two key areas. Firstly, to ensure that the PCC has a robust medium-term financial plan that's affordable and sustainable, as I've alluded to earlier, and to ensure that effectively the ambitions that the PCC describes in his plan in terms of objectives and outcomes can be afforded, can be delivered, and therefore can be met. So in terms of assessing the financial implications of that and the impact of the police and crime plan, I see that very clearly as part of the role. Linking then to the commissioning aspects of the plan. So again, that's seeking to award funds to local authority partners, to the third sector, to a variety of organisations, groups and individuals that the OPCC work with to ensure that commissioning framework is robust, that we have a proper process in terms of access to that it's fair, it's transparent, and supports, amongst other things, the diverse communities that we serve in a fair and appropriate way. So I think understanding how that money would be awarded and ensuring that there's a process that allows for that to be done in the right way would again be key to my role. That's not to say that I would expect any part to play in the decision-making process around how the funds are awarded and to whom, but ensuring that there's a robust methodology and process in place that stands scrutiny, I would see as a key aspect of the role. And it's a matter then for the PCC to determine how those funds would be applied.
Councillor Barclay, we have a question from you.
So I've heard what you said, and a lot of what I'm going to ask you, actually, you've covered quite a lot of ground, but if you just briefly answer, I'd appreciate it. I have been listening to what you're saying, is what I'm trying to say. What you perceive the main differences would be between acting as a Chief Finance Officer for Leicestershire Police and Chief Finance Officer for the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner. what additional challenges would there be as a member of the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner?
I think perhaps what separates the two fundamentally is Chief Finance Officer for the role is very much focused on the operational delivery of a police service, whereas the OPCC, of course, is concerned with that, but is also primarily through the PCC concerned with holding the Chief to account for the delivery of that service, to ensure that there's an appropriate commissioning framework in place. And in terms of the nature of the PCC role under the OPPCC, has a political dimension to it as well. So trying to reconcile the two in terms of operational need and I guess a political need could be a challenge. I think that again in the role of CFO, it would simply be about, to an extent, ensuring that whatever decisions the PCC takes, most but not all have a financial consequence, that those consequences are understood, they're clear, and the PCC then is able to move forward with any decisions he takes with confidence, and understands potentially the impact that may or may not have in a positive or negative sense on the force and operational service delivery. So for me, I see potentially a strength in terms of a shared role, being able to bridge that potential divide and help to assist with the coming together of minds and the dialogue around those issues.
You have another question, I think, Tom.
During your time in the past, acting as Chief Finance Officer for the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner, have any conflicts of interest arisen with your work for the Leicestershire Police, and if so, how did you deal with them?
Well, the short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is, I think it's fair to say that particularly when you go through the budget round process, on some issues, perhaps the OPCC and the force will come at those from a slightly different angle. I think what we have got is a very good relationship between the PCC and Chief, between the OPCC senior management team and the Chief Officer team on the force side, and that relationship certainly has matured over the past few years, and is in a place now, I think, where if there was a potential issue, we would have that dialogue, we would have those conversations, we would find a way through. And happily, I can report to the panel today that I'm not aware of any issues at all where there's been tension, where we've been in a place where there's been impasse. We've always found a way through some very difficult, problematic areas of business. And to an extent, the CFO role can contribute in a positive way towards that.
Thank you.
I have another question from Councillor Pantling.
Hello. How would you approach meetings of the Strategic Assurance Board and the Joint Audit Risk and Assessment Panel, given your dual role as Chief Finance Officer of both Leicestershire Police and the OPCC? That's quite a long question, isn't it? Sorry about that. Is that okay?
Okay, that's fine, thank you. Well, I guess the good news is we've had a JARAP meeting already, where I've been in the dual role. There were no issues to report there of concern. We have a Strategic Assurance Board meeting this coming Wednesday, and again, we're not envisaging any issues or challenges there in relation to the shared role. I think for me, neutrality is probably at the heart of it. So again, it's about the factual presentation of advice, guidance, information in relation to certainly the financial aspects that are considered at Strategic Assurance Board and the financial and audit aspects that are considered at the JARAP, and ensuring that in the presentation of that, my personal views, whatever they may or may not be, are not expressed. It's just purely dealing with the facts in a neutral way and presenting those facts. If that takes us to a place where either potentially the PCC or the chief were to consider a decision that perhaps took us into section 151 territory, then obviously I would have to step forward with a view and an opinion and advise and guide around that in terms of what is and what isn't allowable within that legislation. But we've never had a situation where that's been the case to date, and certainly I don't envisage there being one in the near future. Okay.
That's all the questions I have advance notice of. Are there any more questions from the panel? No. So thank you. That's all the questions and the end of the public part of the hearing. I move that under Section 100A of the Local Government Act 1972 that the public be excluded from the following item of business on the grounds that it involves the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in the paragraphs of Part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1973, and in all circumstances of the case, the public interest in maintaining the exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information. All agreed? Okay. The panel will now go into closed session.